Welcome to the Last Week on Earth podcast. I'm your host, Louisa Magnussen. It's been a big week at the UN with the General Assembly meeting and the recognition of a Palestinian state by the UK, France, Canada and more. Trump addressed the Assembly last Tuesday and both Starmer and Netanyahu are soon to follow suit. This is Last Week on Earth, and now I would like to welcome my guest, journalist Gavin O'Toole. Welcome, Gavin. Good morning, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Why has this been an important week for the Palestinian people, Gavin?
Okay, so a number of countries have recognised the Palestinian state at the United Nations. But what's most important is that these include leading economies, which have hitherto held back, including, of course, the UK, Australia, Canada and France. And the UK and France are on the UN Security Council. They're among its 5 permanent members. So obviously, their contribution to this is more significant than most.
Why is this particularly important for the UK, and what effect does the UK's recognition of Palestine have on Palestine itself and the people?
Well, it's important for the UK because, as the former UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy pointed out at the UN in July, Britain bears a very special responsibility to support what we call the two-state solution. And that's because in 1917, Britain made the so-called Balfour Declaration, which expressed for the first time the United Kingdom's support for the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish homeland, a national home for the Jewish people. But this at the same time did not exclude the population that was already there, the Palestinian people themselves. In fact, the Balfour Declaration made a solemn promise that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Now, Britain ruled this territory through what's known as a League of Nations mandate until 1948, when Israel came into being. And any efforts since then to create a parallel state of Palestine have foundered for lots of different reasons. And as a result, Palestine has long been regarded as unfinished business in both Britain, but also internationally. And international efforts to bring about a two-state solution have come to nothing. At the same time, obviously, Israel has colonized large parts of Palestinian territory in the West Bank, for example, which is illegal under international law. And this has rendered the so-called two-state solution, or the concept at least, precarious, if not completely empty. So Britain's declaration is, at least symbolically, extremely important.
Will it have any practical effect on Palestinian lives?
So critics of the current spate of recognitions by different states at the United Nations argue that these are obviously just symbolic acts, often for domestic audiences, that will, as you say, have little impact on the ground in Gaza, where so many Palestinians are suffering. And in the UK, for example, the Conservative Party immediately branded Britain's recognition as political posturing, arguing that it won't bring either Israeli hostages home or deliver the ceasefire that everyone wants. There is undoubtedly a kind of domestic dynamic to this when it comes to recognition, especially, obviously, in the case of the UK. Downing Street is clearly responding to domestic political pressure to show more support for the Palestinians. And the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has been kind of resisting pressure so far within the Labour Party to do more to stop this terrible situation at considerable cost to his popularity and reputation. That's because recognition of a Palestinian state has long been a Labour manifesto commitment. So his decision came after mounting pressure from Labour MPs, with more than half the parliamentary party signing a letter demanding the government immediately recognise a Palestinian state. And behind the scenes, several cabinet ministers were also pushing quite heavily for recognition, partly because several of them are in seats that they could lose at the next election because of anger over Gaza. So we mustn't forget that there's this domestic pressure, there's pressure within the Labour Party. And of course, this week, on Sunday, begins the Labour Party conference in Liverpool. I don't think it was timed to coincide with that, but of course, for Starmer, it's propitious for timing.
Now, Palestine is already recognised by many countries. Why is this such a huge part of the news agenda on the world stage this time? What's different?
So Palestine's a kind of state that isn't a state. It's a state that already does and yet does not exist. It already has a large degree of international recognition. It has diplomatic missions abroad, teams that compete in sporting competitions, including the Olympics, for example. It's recognized currently by around 75% of the UN's 193 member states, particularly by some very powerful countries. China and Russia both recognized Palestine in 1988. And at the UN itself, it has a status of a permanent observer state, which allows it to participate but not to vote. It's also recognized already by various international organizations, including, of course, the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. But many European countries have until now held back out of fear of alienating the US, until now Europe's main security guarantor, and alienating, of course, Israel, which has traditionally been considered an ally in Europe. And in the case of Germany, obviously, because of an historical commitment to Israel's sort of security and permanence, born of its own history. That doesn't mean, of course, that they won't eventually recognize Palestine. So Germany did not join the countries this week recognizing Palestine at the UN. It's always said that it will recognize Palestine. That must be the final step in a kind of peace process that results in a two-state solution. Now, when we talk about the two-state solution, what do we really mean? That's a kind of blueprint for Israel and the occupied territories that envisages obviously two neighboring sovereign states, Israel and Palestine, living together in peaceful coexistence. And it loosely refers to the creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip along the lines of borders that existed prior to the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, with East Jerusalem occupied by Israel since that war as its capital. Critics say that in the current context, this position by countries in Europe that have held back, such as Germany, has become unviable because a two-state solution is disappearing as we speak. So the chance of a Palestinian state until this week actually kind of being a credible globally recognized entity was slipping out of sight. And at the same time, the population of Palestine has been under bombardment and suffering greatly in the Gaza war. So the reason this is such a big deal is it kind of puts that back on the rails. It kind of reorients the argument back to discussion of a two-state solution, which was evaporating as we speak. But of course, the missing link is the United States. Now, Washington has recognized the Palestinian Authority, which is currently headed by Mahmoud Abbas, since the 1990s. And since then, several US presidents have expressed their support for the eventual creation of a Palestinian state. But Donald Trump is not one of them. Under his administrations, US policy has leaned heavily in favor of Israel. And more recently, it's turned surreptitiously against the very idea of Palestinian statehood. So recognition in a way also reflects disagreement in the international community about how to move forward. And it's very significant that the big economies of Europe have now changed their tune.
And let's talk more about Trump when he addressed the assembly last Tuesday. What were his main points? Why is he resisting? Why is America not joining the UK, France, Canada, and all those countries that are recognizing Palestine?
So Trump said very little, as far as we can tell, on the Middle East in his speech, but he did hold meetings at the UN, and significantly, he held meetings with key Arab leaders who want to subscribe to a UN-sponsored plan that was put forward by France, which would envisage a UN stabilization force entering Gaza as transitional arrangements were made for the two-state solution. And he made a commitment to those Arab states that he would not allow Israel to annex territory in the West Bank. And he repeated that yesterday. Now, that is significant because obviously that's the main fear, or that Israeli anger at European recognition and key economy recognition of Palestine will result in retaliation through annexation, even though in practical terms it controls a good deal of the West Bank already. But the US generally has until now followed the Israeli line, which is that there will probably be no recognition of a Palestinian state. So the US put forward a plan itself yesterday, which is not dissimilar to the French plan, but leaves a great deal of room for maneuver for Israel to have a veto, to drag it out, and to exert its own control over the form a transition to a proper two-state solution would take. And so those two, the US has always played a kind of very pro-Israel sovereign game, which challenges UN authority, but also challenges anything that is critical or not in the interests of Israel.
So, talking about the US, talking about Trump's attitude, talking about the resistance of recognizing Palestine, are there any implications for the UK in going out there recognizing Palestine when the US is resisting? What's going to happen to that relationship between the UK and the US over this particular world issue?
Okay, yes, it does. It puts the UK at odds with the US. And during his state visit recently to the UK, Trump reiterated America's strong opposition to any recognition of a Palestinian state. But bear in mind, the American position has changed. Under Trump and also under Biden, the Americans have become much more hostile to the notion of a Palestinian state. Prior to that, they did entertain the idea, and they've always recognized that a peace process is required. The US generally now echoes the Israeli argument that recognition is a reward for terrorism. And that's a reference, obviously, to the attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023. So, yes, the decision could strain the UK-US relationship, but how is a moot point. The Middle East isn't Trump's only concern. He sees the world globally, and the main priority for the United States globally is China, not the Middle East. So it's give and take. It's undoubtedly the United States will accept resistance and opposition to some of its positions if it gets what it wants elsewhere in the world. So I don't think it puts this so-called special relationship in particular danger. And also that special relationship has been in flux for a long time anyway. No one really knows what it means anymore. Nonetheless, domestically, the decision in the UK could have repercussions. It could alienate, for example, some sections of the British Jewish community. So the Board of Deputies of British Jews, for example, is opposed to this. In a statement following UK recognition, it said there will be deep dismay at the announcement across the Jewish community and among family members of hostages. The board said the way the UK had chosen to do this, to recognize a Palestinian state, had actually done nothing to advance a ceasefire, free the hostages, stop the suffering of Palestinians, or advance long-term peace. Indeed, they say it may have set those goals back by reducing pressure on Hamas and enabling them to claim recognition as the fruits of its violence and its transgressions. I mean, only history will tell us if that's right or wrong, but obviously there is an argument there.
I was going to say, what do you think about that? Do you think that is a case?
I think it all depends on America. I think really it depends on the degree to which Britain and the Europeans can convince America that recognition does sort of reorient a fading transition to a proper peace deal back onto the tracks. So there is an argument. They clearly have an argument that this could set back the situation. But I think if we look a bit later on at Netanyahu and his options, that may not be the case. There may be now what Britain was hoping for, a kind of real momentum towards securing a lasting peace deal that will end this nightmare for everyone.
Because surely that's what we're aiming towards, isn't it? And surely that must be a reason why various countries are recognizing Palestine in order to promote the idea of peace and the end of this war in Gaza.
Listen, this has got to end, hasn't it? I mean, to date, we're talking about, according to the Hamas-controlled health ministry in Gaza, Palestinian fatalities of 65,000 people. But obviously, everyone recognizes that there are many thousands more uncounted under the rubble. Hundreds of thousands have been injured, children, women, More than 1 million people have been displaced. If you look at the pictures, it's quite clear that the bombardment of Gaza has destroyed everything. The infrastructure is non-existent. It will have to be totally rebuilt. So, this is intolerable. And I think everyone has said it cannot go on. But of course, we're dealing with two historic cultures, both of which claim a ferocious right to exist based on historic grievance, historic victimhood. So it's a very difficult problem to solve, and the solution, is obviously exercising the best international minds in terms of leadership and diplomacy. And they still are at the point where, they're only starting a long-term process. So it has to end, but it's not going to end overnight.
I want to just flip the coin a little bit here and ask you, what implications does Palestinian recognition have for Israel?
Yes, so this is significant. It will have significant repercussions. First of all, diplomatically. Obviously, the Israeli government is furious about this and defiant. And as we speak today at the UN, Netanyahu was scheduled to give his address, and everyone has been fearing that there will be some kind of retaliation in terms of annexation. But let's go back to why Israel is so angry. It believes that recognition is a reward for Hamas, which, let's be honest, did spark off the latest round of fighting with its attack on October the 7th. And Netanyahu has been scathing of Britain and of France, calling recognition an absurd prize for terrorism. Israeli ministers insist that recognition will only encourage Hamas and reward terrorism, further reducing the long-term chances of a negotiated settlement. But diplomatically, what recognition does is it further isolates Israel in the eyes of world opinion. And that's important because isolation is becoming a kind of important theme now in Israeli politics. Let's talk about retaliation, however. In response to recognition, the far-right members of Israel's government have threatened to annex, obviously, the West Bank. It's not the first time they've said this, and in many ways it's kind of academic because they already control large parts of the West Bank. It's possible that today Netanyahu will do that, will declare at least a kind of symbolic annexation. Trump insists that Israel won't, but Netanyahu's defied Trump in the past. Trump says, Netanyahu will do as he's told. I doubt it. We'll have to wait and see. Realistically,
previous event.
But if he does so, this would really deepen Israel's divisions, and it would really enhance its isolation with Europe. I mean, obviously, there's nothing Europe can really do about this, but European countries have been very vocal in warning Israel not to respond with retaliation through annexation. Annexation would certainly increase support in Europe for new sanctions and tariffs, and it would raise tensions, obviously, within Europe among countries that are in support of recognition and those that are not, like Germany. France has become a particular target of Netanyahu's government, and that's because, as we mentioned, France has kind of been the driving force of this current round of recognitions. In fact, Starmer in the UK arguably only conceded recognition because France did so before him. And there are signs that Israel is sort of preparing a whole bunch of specific measures to punish France, and there's not a lot he can really do, Netanyahu. But it was very notable yesterday that on his way to the UN, it was reported that Netanyahu's plane had taken a circuitous route through the Mediterranean and the Strait of Gibraltar, specifically to avoid the normal flight path, which would have taken it across France. I find that quite interesting. Also for Israel, diplomatically, they have to think about the Arab world. It's a Middle Eastern country. So retaliation for recognition would widen its rift, its existing rift with Arab states, where officials call any annexation in the West Bank a red line. So that it could lead to a downgrade of diplomatic ties with countries like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, all of which normalized bilateral ties with Israel just 5 years ago under the US-sponsored Abraham Accords. Retaliation would also further distance the United States from its allies around the world, given Trump's defiant, sort of steadfast support for Netanyahu. But US officials have made it abundantly clear since Trump's speech on Tuesday that they will not allow Israel to undermine or dismantle the Abraham Accords. So it's highly unlikely that we'll see any US support for symbolic annexation of US territory.
Thank you for all of that, Gavin. We've got time for just one more question. So finally, will there be any impact on Israeli politics?
Yes, there will. The recognition by key states of Palestine will deepen existing and increasingly serious disagreements within Israel over the Gaza conflict and the conduct of Netanyahu and his government. So let's think about Netanyahu. This is a man who's dominated Israeli politics for 25 years. He's won 5 elections, and he's the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history. He's demonstrated unrivaled political acumen to stay in office, to stay in power. In fact, many of his critics say Netanyahu has created the foundations of a kind of model of one-man rule in Israel by consolidating his power, dominating the media, creating a kind of aura of invincibility. It's hardly surprising, in fact, that some of his closest supporters call him a king. All this means, of course, that Netanyahu has not only been able to shape politics to his own requirement, but he's been able to dominate the narrative heavily when it comes to Israel's security and its relationship with the Palestinians and the Arab world. And that narrative's often employed conspiracy theories and fear-mongering to secure his political authority. It has to be said that Netanyahu has relentlessly incited violence against both Palestinians in the occupied territories and Gaza, and a form of what critics say is apartheid against Palestinian citizens of Israel. Bear in mind that within Israel, there are large numbers of Arab citizens. They are Israeli citizens. And he's depicted these people as a fifth column within Israeli society. So in this way, he's kind of presented himself over the years as the only person capable of protecting Israel from what he calls the Arab threat. And in fact, there are political scientists who've characterized Netanyahu using models that they've developed elsewhere in the world as little more than an authoritarian populist. And that's a word that's in the news a lot at the moment, as we see all over the world the rise of kind of hardline right-wing politicians.
There is a rise in that, isn't there? That's an interesting point you make. What effect is that going to have on the world stage in years to come, that we have this rise in these kinds of leaders?
There are multiple impacts of this rise of the right. And what's probably just as interesting is where this came from all of a sudden. Where it came from, arguably, I would say the consensus in political analysis is the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, which really kind of knocked for six any idea that a model of development under neoliberal reforms of the 1990s could deliver equality, proper public services, and enhanced citizenship in countries where there are high levels of inequality. So as a result, people have turned to extremes. The trouble is, since the 1980s and the fall of the Soviet bloc, the left has been undermined and in many ways discredited. So the only alternative are these anti-political figures who characterize all politicians as corrupt and ineffective, who offer cheap and easy solutions. And that really helps to explain what we call the rise of the far right. In many ways, it's a reaction against politics as normal. So really, the long-term implications of that, to answer your question, are the weakening of political processes and institutions, and the undermining of the democracy, the liberal representative democracies that we've become so used to, that we grew up with. So really, the battle front, in a sense, right now, is to consolidate and to protect those institutions that have maintained a kind of form of world order from
ultimately protect democracy itself across the world.
Ultimately protect democracy. And one reflection of that is what we're seeing in the Middle East, quite simply, because what we're seeing in a way what we're seeing in a way is a division or a tension between what's called multilateralism, which is a belief in international institutions such as the United Nations, and isolationism, especially in the United States, which is a hatred of multilateral institutions such as the United Nations. And that's very, very evident in this case in Israel. Two plans have been put forward for the solution, for a transition to a two-state solution in an endless war. One of them has been put forward largely by France and Saudi Arabia, which envisages a UN commitment to a stabilization force and a kind of technocratic government that would ultimately start to re-establish Palestinian political authority in Gaza. The other solution, which is not that different, has been put forward by the US as the US solution. And this envisages an Arab stabilization force made up of US allies. So the idea is what we're seeing ultimately play out is a tension between multilateralism, the belief in globally important and powerful institutions, versus isolationism, the US belief that everything's bilateral, it can solve these problems alone, it doesn't have to deal with multilateral. And that's important because multilateral power enhances the power of weak countries. The reason the Europeans flock to multilateral institutions is because in relation to the US, they are individually weak, but together they are strong.
Journalist Gavin O'Toole, thank you for talking to me today on Last Week on Earth. We will be back next week for another look at the previous week on Earth in the news agenda across the world. Very interesting discussion, Gavin. Have you got any final advice for anybody listening about how to keep up to date with what's going on and perhaps what the future may bring?
Okay, so the lesson really here is that politics matters. Military force can only take a country, a society so far. Ultimately, all solutions to problems of conflict are political. Peacemaking is political. We've learned that in the UK, in Northern Ireland. Sadly, Israel has not yet learned that, but obviously for specific historical reasons, it's always placed a premium on its security. Ultimately, the solution to the Palestinian problem will be political. That means people have to sit down and they have to talk.
Gavin O'Toole, once again, thank you for joining me today. Really insightful stuff. And I will see you next week on Last Week on Earth.